The fields of Normandy turned into a maze of death in the summer of 1944. There was danger behind every hedge, every stone wall could hide a machine gun nest, every village street became a trap. The German defenses turned the French countryside into an ideal battlefield for defenders. There was no room for wide tank breakthroughs or swift cavalry attacks of the past. Here, the war was fought meter by meter, life for life, and every mistake was paid for in blood. In this hell of offensive operations, where the Allied armies lost thousands of men for every kilometer of advance, one feature of the Canadian units attracted attention and commanded respect even from the enemy. The Canadians moved differently. Their attacks were not swift or reckless, but possessed a quality that is valued above courage in military affairs: reliability. When the Canadian infantry met resistance, something almost mathematically precise happened. A short radio broadcast, a few minutes of waiting, then the sky was torn by the roar of falling shells, and the resistance melted like snow under the spring sun. The secret of this effectiveness lay not in numerical superiority or technological miracle. Canada did not have the resources of the great powers. Its army was modest by the standards of the World War, its industry could not compete with American factories, and its human reserves were limited. But what the Canadian military could not boast of in quantity, they compensated for with the quality of the organization. At the center of their war machine was a gun that most armies considered mediocre, an 88mm British field cannon, known as a 25-pound projectile. At first glance, this weapon did not represent anything revolutionary. Medium caliber, reasonable firing range, acceptable mobility, standard field artillery, which was used by dozens of armies around the world. British designers created it as a universal instrument of war, capable of supporting infantry, resisting tanks and providing defense. Thousands of such guns served in British, Australian, New Zealand and Indian units. But it was in Canadian hands that the 25-pounder unlocked the potential that changed the very philosophy of artillery warfare. To understand the Canadian achievement, it is necessary to understand how other armies used artillery in those years. The Germans, whose artillery school was considered one of the strongest in the world since the First World War, tied the guns to rigid organizational structures. Each division had its own artillery, and each corps had its own heavy batteries. Fire plans were drawn up at headquarters, coordinates were calculated in advance, and any change in the situation required passing through the chain of command. In a mobile war, when the front was changing hourly, such a system often malfunctioned. The German guns fired great, but not always where they needed to be at the moment. The Soviet army chose the path of massive artillery use. Their famous artillery training turned entire sections of the front into moonscapes where nothing alive could survive. Thousands of guns opened fire simultaneously, creating a firestorm of incredible power. But this tactic required careful preparation, a huge expenditure of ammunition, and worked best in conditions of positional warfare or pre-planned offensives. When the situation changed unpredictably, when pinpoint support for small units was required, the Soviet system showed less flexibility. The American army, which has entered the war with the industrial might of an entire continent behind its back, has created an impressive artillery machine. Their fire control centers were a technological marvel, capable of coordinating the actions of multiple batteries and regiments. American gunners could bring down hundreds of guns on a target using sophisticated calculations and modern means of communication. However, even in the American system, the time required for information to flow through the chain of command, approval, calculation, and transmission of the order to the executors passed between the infantry request and the opening of fire. All these armies understood the value of artillery. All of them invested huge resources in the development of this branch of the military. But all of them, to one degree or another, considered artillery as a tool that works according to plan. The fire was scheduled for a certain time, for pre-selected targets, as part of a general operation. The artillery was like a heavy hammer that would fall on the enemy with predictable force at a predictable moment. This predictability was both a strength and a weakness. The Canadians chose a different path. Their approach was born not out of an abundance of resources, but out of necessity. Canada could not afford the tactics of massive attacks with heavy losses. Every soldier was valuable, and every division lost weakened the Dominion's already limited forces. Canadian commanders faced a stark choice: either find a way to fight more effectively, or accept unacceptable losses. They have found a solution in what can be called a revolution in management. The basis of the Canadian system was the decentralization of control over artillery fire. While other armies kept this control at the level of division or corps headquarters, the Canadians transferred it to the lowest tactical level, directly to the front line. The key figures of this system were forward surveillance officers, specially trained gunners who did not stay in firing positions behind the front, but went into battle with infantry companies and battalions. These officers were not casual observers, but highly qualified specialists. They underwent intensive training, learned how to instantly determine the coordinates of targets, calculate corrections for wind and weather, and negotiate by radio under enemy fire. But most importantly, they learned to think like infantrymen, to understand offensive and defensive tactics, and to anticipate where a critical situation might arise. Each officer carried a portable radio station, which connected him directly to the artillery batteries waiting a few kilometers behind the front line. When the Canadian infantry company moved to its starting positions for the attack, the surveillance officer went with it. He shared with the infantrymen all the dangers of advancing, machine gun fire, mortar attacks, artillery raids. He saw the battlefield with the same eyes as the company commander, understood the same problems, assessed the same threats. And when the company suddenly stopped in front of an unexpected obstacle, a hidden machine gun nest in the ruins of a farm, an anti-tank gun behind a stone wall, a group of German infantry entrenched on the opposite slope of the hill, the surveillance officer did not begin the lengthy process of transmitting information up the chain of command. He simply picked up the microphone of the walkie-talkie and called the coordinates of the target. After a few seconds, his request reached the commander of the artillery battery. A minute later, the calculations made adjustments to the gun sights. A minute later, the first shells were already flying towards the target. The time from detecting a threat to opening fire on it was sometimes less than 3 minutes, a speed impossible in traditional artillery control systems. But the reaction speed was just the beginning. The Canadian system had another quality that made it truly unique: continuous adaptability. After the first shells landed on the target, the surveillance officer did not switch off and did not move on to the next task. He continued to observe, assessing the effectiveness of the fire. If the shells landed inaccurately, he immediately transmitted the corrections. If the target turned out to be more solid than expected, he requested increased fire or a change in the type of projectiles. If the enemy tried to move or counterattack, the fire shifted after him. The result was artillery, which not only supported the offensive, but participated in it as a living organism, constantly reacting to changes in the situation. German soldiers who survived the clashes with the Canadian units described this feeling in their memoirs. They talked about the artillery, which seemed omnipresent, which always found them at the most inopportune moment, which did not give them a second's respite. One German officer wrote in a dispatch, "It's impossible to find a safe position against the Canadians. If you open fire, the shells will fall on you in minutes. They see everything and hear everything." This system required absolute trust between infantry and artillery, between the junior officers at the front and the gun crews behind it. The gunners had to believe that the coordinates transmitted by radio were accurate, even if they could not see the target with their own eyes. Infantry commanders had to believe that the shells would fall exactly where they needed to, and not on their own heads. The surveillance officers had to keep their thinking clear under fire, not panic, and not make mistakes that could cost their comrades their lives. The creation of such a system required intensive training and iron discipline from the Canadian Army. Forward surveillance officers received months of special training. The artillery crews trained to execute commands at maximum speed, bringing every movement to automatism. Infantry units learned to coordinate their actions with artillery, to understand the possibilities and limitations of gun support. The whole system was built on the foundation of professionalism, mutual respect, and a common understanding of goals. The 25-pounder proved to be the ideal tool for this system, not because of its outstanding characteristics, but because of its versatility and reliability. The gun could fire various types of projectiles: high explosive to destroy manpower and fortifications, armor-piercing to fight tanks, smoke to create curtains, lighting for night operations. It was light enough to quickly change positions, but powerful enough to effectively hit targets. Its mechanisms were simple and reliable, which made it possible to maintain a high rate of fire even in harsh conditions. But the main thing was that the 25-pounder made it possible to conduct accurate fire at various distances and from different angles. In the conditions of Normandy, where distances were short and visibility was limited, this quality proved invaluable. The gun could shoot overhangs over hills and buildings, hitting targets hidden from line of sight. It could quickly transfer fire from one target to another, following the development of the battle. It could conduct single-aim fire or create dense fire curtains, depending on the requirements of the moment. When Canadian units began using their system in combat, the results exceeded expectations. In Normandy, where every hedge became a defensive line and every village a fortress, the Canadian infantry advanced slowly but inexorably. Their attacks were not rapid breakthroughs, the landscape did not allow such operations. But they were methodical and effective. When faced with resistance, the Canadians did not rush into a frontal attack and did not retreat in confusion. They stopped, called for artillery, suppressed the firing point and continued moving. This approach turned the offensive into a series of solvable problems. Every obstacle could be overcome, every threat could be neutralized. There were losses, of course, but the war remained a war. But they were significantly smaller than with alternative methods of attack. Canadian units were able to maintain offensive operations longer than many other Allied units because their losses were manageable and morale remained high. The German command quickly noticed the peculiarities of the Canadian tactics. In the captured documents of the German Wehrmacht, there are references to exceptionally effective artillery support for Canadian units. The German commanders warned their troops that it was especially dangerous to expose their positions with premature fire against the Canadians. But it was almost impossible to follow this advice. When the Canadian infantry approached, you either had to shoot or retreat. And the shooting immediately triggered a retaliatory artillery strike. The psychological effect of this system was no less important than the physical one. German soldiers, accustomed to predictable patterns of artillery raids, found that the old rules did not work against Canadians. It was impossible to wait out the shelling in cover and then take up positions to repel the attack. The artillery continued to work during the attack itself. It was impossible to use pauses in the shelling to regroup. The pauses were unpredictable and short. It was impossible to feel safe on the second line of defense. The Canadian observers saw it too. This constant pressure, this inability to find a moment of relative safety, exhausted the morale of the defenders no less than the physical destruction. German units fighting against the Canadians reported high levels of stress among their personnel and difficulties in maintaining discipline during prolonged defensive actions. The soldiers knew that any activity could trigger an immediate artillery response, and this knowledge paralyzed the initiative, making defense passive and ineffective. Field trials of the Canadian system continued in Italy, where conditions were different from the Normandy, but were no less difficult. Italian mountains, narrow valleys, and medieval hilltop towns created a landscape where traditional tactics often didn't work. Tanks could not operate on steep slopes. The aircraft could hardly distinguish the targets among the stone and vegetation. There remained infantry and artillery, the oldest combination of military branches, proven by centuries of military history. In Italian conditions, the Canadian system has proven its versatility. The 25-pounders, capable of mounted fire, could hit targets on the reverse slopes of hills inaccessible to direct fire. Surveillance officers operating from forward infantry positions could see hidden enemy approaches and escape routes that were not visible from rear observation posts. The mobility of the guns made it possible to quickly change firing positions, following the advance of the infantry along mountain trails and roads. One of the most outstanding examples of the effectiveness of the Canadian artillery system was the Battle of the Scheldt Estuary in the fall of 1944. It was an operation where almost all the traditional advantages of a modern army were neutralized by geography. Swampy terrain, cut by canals and dams, flooded fields, narrow strips of solid land between the water spaces, there was no room for wide maneuvers. Tanks could only move along dams and roads, where they became easy targets. Aviation was often unable to operate due to bad weather. Everything depended on the infantry's ability to capture section after section of fortified terrain. Under these conditions, the Canadian artillery became not just a support, but the main means of warfare. Each attack on German positions was carefully coordinated with artillery fire. The Battle of the Scheldt cost the Canadian army heavy losses, more than 6,000 killed and wounded in several weeks of fighting. But these losses would have been immeasurably higher without effective artillery support. The German units defending the Scheldt estuary were experienced and well entrenched. They had all the advantages of defending themselves in difficult terrain. However, the Canadians broke through the defenses and completed the task, opening access to the vital port of Antwerp. By the end of the war, the Canadian artillery control system was recognized as one of the most effective among the Allied armies. Officers from other national contingents studied the Canadian experience and tried to implement similar methods in their troops. But simple copying did not produce the same results. It was not only about technology or organization, but also about the culture of the army, the level of training, and the mutual trust between the various branches of the armed forces. The Canadian system was not born in one day. It has been forming for years, dating back to the interwar period, when Canadian military theorists studied the experience of the First World War and thought about how to avoid a repeat of senseless mass attacks of that time. She was perfected in the training camps of England, where the Canadian Army was trained in 1940 to 1943. It was tested and refined in real battles in Italy and northwestern Europe. Logistics and technical support were an important part of this system. Artillery, which conducts intense fire, consumes a huge amount of shells. The Canadian units had to have a reliable supply of ammunition, their rapid delivery to firing positions, and effective distribution systems between batteries. The radios required constant maintenance, batteries, and spare parts. The guns needed regular technical inspection, replacement of worn barrels, and repair of mechanisms. All this required the coordinated work of many services and departments. Canadian gunners prided themselves on their ability to maintain a high rate of fire for extended periods of time. Well-trained crews could fire up to 8 rounds per minute, an impressive rate for a gun of this class. At critical moments in the battle, one battery of 8 guns could bring down more than 60 shells per minute on a target. And when several batteries or entire regiments were coordinated, the density of fire became simply staggering. But the number of shots was never an end in itself. The Canadian philosophy of artillery combat emphasized efficiency rather than wastefulness. It is better to fire 20 shells precisely at the target than 100 shells in the approximate direction. It is better to suppress a specific threat quickly and accurately than to launch a prolonged bombardment of a wide area. This frugal, pragmatic approach reflected the general nature of Canadian military culture, doing more with fewer resources, relying on skill rather than excess funds. The 25-pounder continued to serve in the Canadian Army after the end of World War II. She participated in the Korean War, where she again proved her effectiveness. Even in the 1960s, these guns were still in service with many armies around the world. But the historical significance of the 25-pounder is not in the durability of its design, but in the fact that it was with this gun that a system was created that changed the approach to using artillery. The lessons of the Canadian experience of the Second World War have not lost their relevance in the modern era. The principles of decentralizing control, direct communication between those who see a target and those who can hit it, and quick reaction to changes in the situation, all this remains important in military affairs. Technologies have changed. Digital communication systems have replaced radio stations, laser rangefinders and GPS navigation have replaced optical sights. But the fundamental idea remains the same. Maximum efficiency is achieved when decisions are made at the lowest level by those who see the situation best. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Canadian forces had almost 2 years of continuous fighting under their belt. From the beaches of Sicily to the rivers of Holland, from the hedges of Normandy to the marshes of the Scheldt, they went through some of the bloodiest battles of the war. Their achievements were often overshadowed by the operations of the larger Allied armies. But those who fought alongside or against the Canadians knew the true value of their professionalism. German General Kurt Meyer, who commanded the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth against the Canadians in Normandy, wrote in his memoirs after the war, "The Canadians were opponents whom we learned to respect. Their artillery was ruthless and omnipresent. She haunted us day and night." This recognition from a man who commanded one of the best formations of the Wehrmacht says more than any official assessment.